I'm on my way to interview Dr. Geert Somsen, who's an assistant professor at Maastricht University, and who's just published an article entitled Science, Fascism and Foreign Policy in the last issue of ISIS. So I'm going to ask him a couple of questions about this article.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Welcome to my office.
Yeah, it's great to see you. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your latest article.
Sure, yeah.
Can I start?
Yes.
Okay, so your paper focuses on a science exhibition at the Scienza Universale di Roma, a planned but never realized World's Fair that would have taken place in 1942 in fascist Italy. Can you describe what this exhibition would have looked like? What were its central didactic aims?
Yes, well, the exhibition itself didn't take place, but the exhibition grounds actually can still be seen. So if you're really curious, you just travel to Rome and go to those grounds. They're currently known as the EUR area, part of Rome, which stands for Universal Exhibition of Rome. They were completed after the war to hold the 1960 Olympics in Rome, and now they're just a neighborhood, so it's a very beautiful part. A lot of movies have been shot there because it's quite a striking sort of modernist, classicist environment. But your question was about the science exhibit within the World's Fair that was eventually not held. Well, that of course is not there, has never been there, but if it had been completed, and it was almost completed, it would have been quite an impressive exhibition. It was in a very beautiful building full of marble columns and lots of light, a very grand exhibition. They also planned to use the latest exhibition techniques, so they wouldn't just have showcases with all sort of objects, but they would have lots of visuals, slide projections, movies, working instruments, and even live experiments that they would perform at the exhibition. There was at some point even a plan to have a cyclotron there, a particle accelerator, just for show, at the exhibition. Now its didactic purposes, and they were certainly there, was to give a historical exhibit that would expose the history of science, so its development over time, showcasing how progress had been made, and it would particularly stress the Italian contributions to the history of science. So there was a lot of stress on the importance of Italian scientists and innovators. Of course, people like Galileo and Volta and Leonardo and all sorts of great names that had made modern Western science.
Great. You discussed the World's Fair in the context of a larger historiographical debate about scientific internationalism. Why is this particular case exemplary?
Well, the exhibition really stressed and emphasized that science was universal and that as such it had a message to the world at large. It was sort of a beacon, a model for how society could function in general. So in that sense it really was a specimen of scientific internationalism as an ideology. Now scholars have studied scientific internationalism in various ways, but they usually either see it as completely apolitical, or they associate it very much with the progressive left. Now in my research, because this is part of a larger project on internationalism, I have found that there are also many varieties of internationalism involving science as a model that are very much of the right, so conservative and sometimes imperialist. So in order to stress that point and really demonstrate the political variability of scientific internationalism, I chose here to study an extreme variety, which is scientific internationalism in a fascist vein, employed by the Italian fascist government in this case.
A major theme in your essay is an intricate interplay between nationalism and internationalism that was to be manifested in the exhibition of Universal Science. Can you illustrate that dynamic?
Sure, yeah. Well, you know, nationalism and international are pretty much indistinguishable in this case, and actually in many cases they sort of go together, they go hand in hand. So this exhibition made by the Mussolini's government really stressed the universal and the international character of science, of the scientific enterprise, at the same time that it stressed the importance of Italian contributions to that enterprise. And those things go hand in hand, because those Italian contributions can only really be seen as so important in a sort of international comparison, right? So they only come out because they can compete with contributions from other countries. It's very much the model of the Olympic Games, right? Which are international at the same time that they stress national accomplishment and national victories. So that's very much the framework. At the same time, what the exhibition did is stress Italian contributions to science as contributions to the universal stock of knowledge, as sort of Italian gifts to humankind. So in this way, for the regime, universal science was a way to show Italian contributions to the world and to show how Italy had a leading role, was a leading nation in the world of universal science.
One of your conclusions is that the internationalism of the science exhibit came with a map and that universalism was not shapeless. You therefore refer to the geographical hierarchies that the exhibit's bolstering of universalism sought to construct. Can you elaborate on this thought?
Certainly. It's an issue that really connects, I think, to the previous questions. So what the exhibition makers wanted to organize was what they called an Olympics of civilizations. So the idea was that the history of science, the record of science, would show how each nation contributed to the universal stock of knowledge. So in a sort of friendly competition between civilized peoples. So the map that it came with there was really a map of civilization in the world, right? So there was a sort of hierarchy. The most civilized country would also likely be the most productive of scientific insights. But it also got a different dimension. This dimension became more important because what the Italians stressed was that their contributions to science had a mostly intellectual character. So that the Italians were the ones who produced initial ideas, sparks of thought, the sort of general insights and conceptual contributions that then subsequently other countries could that they could adopt and they could apply to, you know, sort of applied insights and technological applications. So the idea was the Italians come with the great ideas, make the intellectual contributions, after which other nations can use those and apply them. And that gave Italians a particularly leading role because their contributions would come first and the rest would apply them. Now this got a special geopolitical dimension after 1940 when they were still planning the exhibition, because by then Italy had really been outstripped as a leading fascist nation, of course by Nazi Germany, because Hitler had just conquered most of Europe and Italy had hardly had any role in that. So they had really been reduced to a second-rate fascist country. And fascism seemed to be ruling the world at that brief moment in time. So Italy really felt thrown back, and in order to sort of reclaim a leadership position, they would say, okay, Italians are generally the generators of initial ideas and then others apply them. Now this was true in science, and that's what they showed in the science exhibition, but of course the analog there was that Mussolini had invented fascism, an Italian invention in an intellectual sense, and Hitler was just applying his ideas, so that the German conquests and the German victories were nothing but the application of a plan that had been grown in Italy. So really the leader of the world was not Nazi Germany but fascist Italy. So that was a sort of geopolitical hierarchy that was implied in the exhibition around 1940.
It's very interesting. Finally, in your conclusion, you point out that the story of the exhibit can teach us something about Italian fascism in general. What?
Well, of course there's loads of insights and publications about fascism, especially also about science and fascism, especially scientists under Hitler and Nazi science. But the Italian case is a little different, I think. There's also quite some literature there, so it's not entirely new, but what we can really see from this exhibit, that once and for all we should let go of the idea that fascism was anti-science. Italian fascists really embraced science as something to show themselves with. They were proud of scientific accomplishments under fascism, and they really believed that Italian science flowered after Mussolini. So it's very much, fascism cannot be seen as an enemy of scientific progress. At the same time, fascism is usually seen as an ultranationalism, so something that, a political movement that rejects internationalisms. Well, that's not the case here either. Italian fascism really wanted to be part of a larger international framework and try to sell its product, so to speak, abroad. So they really had an idea of an international order in which Italy should and could play a role. Finally, maybe what's perhaps interesting is that Italian fascist accounts of their own civilization and the role of science in that were quite compatible with a view of the history of science that is actually quite familiar. Of course, the exhibition told stories about the history of science in which Italians had a bigger role, but apart from that, it's a pretty familiar story with the familiar heroes. I actually had an American colleague who responded to this when I gave a talk about this subject, who was really sort of shocked to hear that the sort of history of science that she had been teaching for a long while is one that could have been used for these fascist agendas. And I think in a way it is a little shocking. Now that of course doesn't mean necessarily that the history of science we do is fascist by nature, but it does show you how flexible and politically flexible history of science can be.
Thank you very much. This was a great interview, and yeah, thanks for answering all these questions.
You're very welcome.